Okay, so I think everybody now has joined the webinar, and thank you for joining the biggest governance event that is going to be held today, well, at least this side of the pond. And it's great to see there's so much interest in the code. Just some kind of practicalities and some introductions. I want to say, first of all, I'm joined by Dan Francis, who's the lead governance consultants at NCVO, and I'm also pleased and delighted to be joined by Parry Dillon, who's a consultant who is helping us with the diversity aspect of the code. I also want to do a big up for the magic that is being made to happen by Claire and Rupinder, who are behind the scenes making it all happen. And lastly, I can't not thank, because they are so invaluable, our funders, Clothworkers Company and Barrow Cadbury Trust, who've been really helpful to us along the journey. So if we go on to the next slide, well, what are you going to hear us talk about? Well, we want to kind of quickly go over the journey so far and a recap on the consultation. We want to kind of share with you how the integrity principles coming along and the diversity principle, and to kind of give you some more updates on that. And then we'll have some questions, and we'll then talk to you about next steps and plans for publication. Now, I suspect some of you have joined because you think, Trustees Week, they're going to be launching the new edition of the code. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. You won't just be able to click and get the new edition of the code after this session. However, what I think you will get if you stay for this session is a sneaky preview into how it's shaping up and what it's going to look like. So if I could kind of move on to the next slide, that'd be great. The journey so far, and sorry, apologies, I meant to say that we were originally going to be joined by Louise Thompson, the author of this wonderful slide from ICSA, the Governance Institute, but unfortunately she's unable now to join us today. But I am hoping that one or two other members of the Code Steering Group are with us. I think Maya Rigby from WCVA might be with us. So if we get any difficult questions that relate to Wales, we may yet draw upon Maya to help us in that regard. So why did we have this kind of roller coaster? Well, back in 2017, when we launched the new edition of the Charity Governance Code, which we launched with some gusto, it was very well received, a kind of updated code specifically for charities, very well received, signs of it being adopted and well used. And when we published it in 2017, we always made a commitment that we wanted to keep it alive and relevant. And so to that end, I think it was almost a year to the day last year, in last year's Trustee Week, we launched a consultation 3 years on of publishing the new edition of the code, to a consultation on how we might keep the code relevant. And when we carried out that consultation, we were also testing out our hypothesis that we thought that the integrity principles and the diversity principles were the ones that needed changing, and that the rest could stay as is for now, so that we could embed things. Of course, and hence the roller coaster, all this happened. The consultation was carried out pre-COVID, and of course, from 17th of March, whenever it was, we've had an interesting time as we've encountered the pandemic. And we did kind of think, well, should we just mothball any changes to the code and not go further? But we decided as a group that actually, if anything, the pandemic has highlighted the structural and personal inequalities, and also I think the value of integrity, and indeed the harm that is caused when individuals don't act with integrity or it's abused. So actually, we think despite all what's going on, now more than ever is a time to update the code to make sure it's relevant. So I'm now going to hand over to Dan, who's going to say a bit about what the consultation told us. Dan's gone quiet on me, but I hope he's still here. Are you there, Dan? I will carry on because I've got a feeling Dan might have frozen, so I'll quickly cover his bit. So the public consultation findings, well, the first thing, and was really uplifting for us, was that we had 130 substantive comments to our consultation on possible changes to the code, and there were over 800 pieces of feedback from organisations and individuals. And pleasingly, there were 84% of respondents of the main consultation said they were either very satisfied or satisfied with the code. Although a slightly different question asked by the Small Charities Coalition, only 42% of their respondents said that, although it's fair to say the other 58% were neutral, they weren't negative. So I think that's quite a positive endorsement for the code. And we were also really pleased that there was a lot of support. 85% of people responding to our consultation supported our idea of a refresh rather than a complete rewrite at this stage. And the other kind of themes that came out from the consultation was it was clear that the understanding and meaning of integrity had evolved to incorporate ethics and the right to be safe, and there was significant interest in the need to sharpen up what we were saying about equality, diversity and inclusion. I'm now going to have another go at handing over to Dan, who hopefully, if you can't see him, will be able to say a bit more. Lovely, thanks.
Can you hear me this time? Yeah, good. Well, we'll give this a try, and if not, Rosie, you can take back over. So can I have the next slide, please? So these are some of the proposed changes to that integrity principle. This is after a period of us kind of reflecting on the need for change. To the actual principle itself, I think the key change here is the emphasis on values, ethical principles in decision making, as well as that right to be safe and the creation of a welcoming and supportive culture which helps achieve the charity's purpose. So you can see there that first quote is a lift from our proposed text, which is that the board acts with integrity, adopting values, applying ethical principles to decisions, and creating that welcoming and supporting culture. But we've also made changes to the rationale and the outcomes. And with the rationale, we say everyone who comes in contact with the charity should be treated with dignity and respect, feel that they are in a safe and supportive environment, and moreover, those that lead the charity exhibit and are held to the highest levels of personal integrity and conduct. You can see here a kind of a renewed emphasis, I suppose, on that creation of a right to be safe and a safe space, but also the behaviours and integrity of the individuals. And we really draw on, particularly in the outcomes, the language from the NCVO ethical principles work, which was done at the end of 2017, but also the creation of kind of welcoming and supportive environments, which really draws on the right to be safe. So I'll take the next slide. And just to go into a little bit more detail in terms of some of the changes that we're proposing to the recommended practice, we have we've really enhanced the section which is on upholding the charity's values to place, as I say, greater emphasis on trustee decisions and actions and ensuring these are consistent with the stated values. We've drawn a link which actually didn't exist before between a trustee code of conduct and those stated values to ensure those things kind of align. And not only do we make reference to the Nolan principles, which was in the 2017 edition, but we now make reference to those high-level statements of the charity ethical principles, and also weave that language from the ethical principles through all of the practice. There's a new section on that right to be safe, which emphasizes the need for trustees to have a detailed understanding of their safeguarding responsibilities, to establish appropriate and I suppose context-specific procedures that integrate with the charity's existing risk management systems and implement training. And then crucially, we've also put practice into the principle on ensuring that the trustee board making sure that there's a culture, an environment, and a set of procedures which ensure that everybody who comes in contact with the charity knows how to speak up and how to raise concerns. And then finally, we've retained that all-important section on identifying, dealing and recording personal conflicts of interest and loyalty. That remains unchanged actually in this text because we felt it was so important. So I hope you're able to hear me through those two slides, which give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour and a preview of some of the changes to that integrity principle. I'm going to hand over to Parry at this point, who's going to talk through some of our learning in respect to the diversity work.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. My name's Parry Dillon. My pronouns are she and her. And I work as a consultant supporting people across all of our sector to maximise their social impact. Myself and my colleague, Shaka Bachman, who couldn't be here today, have been working with the Code Steering Group and a range of experts in the field to start work on a revised diversity principle. As part of the research process, we held a whole range of interviews and focus groups with people across the sector. And I'm going to be talking for the next few minutes about 7 key things that we learned from those sessions in terms of good practice for equality, diversity and inclusion in governance. And I'll probably use the phrase EDI to make that less of a mouthful as I talk about it. So the first key learning is that it's a journey. We found that most people in our sector are really eager to get going on creating more equitable organisations and outcomes, but there is a risk of rushing to fix a problem. And the challenge with that is that rushing to take action on EDI may well lead to taking actions such as moving straight to recruiting diverse trustees, potentially into cultures that are not yet set up to actually include them. So rushing to fix a problem in this way could lead to tokenism or cause more damage. So what instead of that? Instead of rushing to action, we found that a better place to start is with number 2 on our list, which is to ask ourselves why. Why is EDI important for our charity? It's key at this stage to make time and space to talk as a board about what equity, equality, diversity and inclusion means for your charity and for your board. Assessing why it's important within your context. And it was really clear from feedback that context is important. So the idea that, for example, for a medical research charity, EDI might be important because the inequalities in society are reflected in the boardroom and then are potentially reflected in the decisions on health inequalities. So this board might therefore focus their energy on imbalances in power and perspective by involving those who experience health inequality in their decision making, but also in their data and their research. But for a small Lincolnshire bowling club, EDI might be important because their service provision is not reaching working class people in the village. And so they may create space on their board for working class voices to shape an organisation more reflective and relevant to that community. So context is really important. And then the next stage of this is after asking yourselves why, it's important to ask yourselves, why don't we have that now? So who is or who is not on our board and why not? Why have we not considered data on minoritized communities in our decision making in the past? Now, this stage of assessing your current understanding, your practice and your culture around EDI will allow your board to be clear on its starting point. A few practical ways of doing this might include adding things like diversity audits to your annual skills audits, carrying out role reviews to ensure that your requirements aren't limiting who's able to be a trustee, holding exit interviews to understand why diverse trustees may not have felt included. It might be carrying out 360 reviews on those who make decisions and whether those decisions can be challenged by a range of perspectives. For service charities, it might be checking whether your board reflects the people that you seek to serve. And I think for all charities, it's important to start discussing critically and honestly whether your meetings are spaces in which everyone has power to participate and shape decisions. Now, step 4, after you've done this assessment, you will have created a greater shared understanding across your board that will allow you to set yourself some goals that are both relevant to your context and start from your current reality. And actually, I think at this point, it's really unhelpful to plan to have all of this cracked in one step. It's much better to focus on what's important to your charity, as I set out in step 2, and then also define what your time-bound and realistic goals need to be to achieve what's important. And this could be a whole range of things. For some, that will mean working hard to create inclusive cultures and behaviours, which might also include deciding what inclusive cultures and behaviours don't look like and what to do when you see that happening. It might mean the whole board committing to some learning in order to create that inclusive culture. And for some, it might mean that once that inclusive culture is created and agreed, there's an opportunity to begin to make space for new members. And by making space, I don't mean just opening up one position on the board for a diverse trustee to join and be given entire responsibility for EDI, because of course that risks tokenism. Instead, when I talk about making space on your board, it can literally mean creating space for more than one new trustee, ideally 3, to join at around the same time so that a tipping point is created for culture change. Making space can also mean creating time on agendas for the whole board to engage in discussions and decisions relating to EDI, and creating space in all board role descriptions for EDI responsibility. For some, it will mean working with the executive of the charity to define new directions or strategies that will help to create equality of outcomes in line with the charity's purpose. One little note or word of warning here on recruiting more diverse trustees. The message has come back really strong and clear that boards must avoid recruiting through their own networks or recruiting informally, and instead to make use of the advice, databases and reach of organisations, and to name just a few, the Action for Trustee Racial Diversity or the Young Trustees Movement have got a fantastic range of resources and also a great reach out into communities. And also to apply inclusive and formal practice as set out in documents such as Akivo's Home Truths Report. So step 5, once your goals are set, the stage is set for taking action, reviewing it and learning from it, kind of on a loop really. And it's important at this stage to be willing to make mistakes and to learn from them. So some of you on this call, I'm sure, will have heard me say this before, but EDI is not like changing the fuse in a plug. You don't learn how to do it once and then just repeat it. Instead, it's a process of self-assessment and learning, taking some action and being willing to learn from successes and failures along the way. It's iterative, it's constantly evolving, just as society is evolving. And for me, actually, it's quite a liberating way to look at this work because it allows us to keep on trying and learning, even if, or I should maybe say, especially when mistakes are made along the way. So stage 6, once you've started to take some actions towards your context-specific goals, it's also important to begin to publish your performance against these goals. Ideally, together, we can create a sector in which people are sharing their progress, their performance, and what they have learned from their challenges. And just as I said in the way that goals should be contextualized, one of the key recommendations arising from our research is that performance reporting will be most powerful if it is also contextualized. So, for example, reporting on racial or gender balances of a board might be an excellent measure of diversity, but it could also mask the actual power imbalances that persist in boardrooms, where the power positions or decision-making processes are still very exclusive. So reporting on diversity must be coupled with reporting on inclusion and ultimately on the equality of outcomes achieved. But for all boards, there is the immediate opportunity to report on its performance against the goals that it sets for itself within its context and in relation to its current reality. And I believe that this will result in more meaningful change for many charity boards, no matter where they are at on their stages of this journey. Which brings me back to the point that this is a journey and it's an ongoing journey. And so as your context changes and as society changes, as you continue to learn and as resources increase, or more likely in this current climate decrease, EDI becomes ever more important to ensure that boards are relevant to the shifting challenges that our sector is facing and that our resources are reaching those who need them the most. It is an ongoing journey to keep on building and maintaining a board that is diverse and inclusive and delivers equality through the charity's purpose and mission. And I hope that today is a step forward on that journey. I'll stop there and I will hand back over to Rosie.
It's lovely. Thanks for that. So how does all that translate into what might go into the code? Well, when we consulted on the 2017 edition of the code, we thought we were pushing on the boundaries, and a number of people said, well, why have you got a separate principle for diversity? And we argued that we thought it was important, so it wasn't overlooked. I mean, with hindsight, that feels absolutely like it was the right decision, but it's also obvious from the consultation that there is an appetite, dare I say even a need, to say and do more. And as Parry's pointed out, we have been engaging and listening and thinking about what we've heard through the consultation, through the research, and through reaching out to hear the views of experts and others. And as a result of that process, we aspire to ensure that the updated principle sets out a plan that enables charities to be bolder in their approach to equality, diversity and inclusion. And we also want, because the code is a code for all charities, albeit, you know, there's different versions for different sizes, we want the principle to be relevant to the widest group of charities and not to put off charities who may be at different stages on their diversity journey. And on a practical level, we've made a commitment that the code, through all the wording of the code, has to be accessible and written in plain language that is accessible to all. Now, we've got a bit more work to do to make sure we get the wording right. We're also kind of making sure that the code and the recommended practice is as precise as possible, and to think some more about where and how supporting guidance might be provided, not least because we know a lot of people had said, we want to do something, but we don't know how. So what are we then doing? Well, first of all, thinking about the new rationale for the EDI principle, we're going to provide a sharper rationale to help set the context for the EDI principle and to make the case for why it's important. And in particular, we are planning to do two things in the rationale. One, and this might be contentious for some people, but I hope not. But one, to acknowledge up front that inequalities and prejudices in society are often reflected in the boardroom and in charity service provision, unless there is a concerted effort to counter imbalances in power, perspective and opportunity. And secondly, we think it's important actually in this principle to make the link in the rationale, make the link to the public benefit that all charities are required to deliver. And what do I mean by that? Well, that charities should seek to remove any obstacles to participation within any restrictions that might be set out in their governing documents. And to kind of help frame the principle, we are going to retitle it to more broadly reflect what we're aiming to achieve. So it will now be called Equality, Diversity and inclusion. So in terms of the outcomes that we want to achieve, well, they're written on the slide, so I'm just getting rid of my. So one is about ensuring that the EDI principles are embedded and they help to deliver the public benefit. And the second is about the countering of imbalances of power, perspective and opportunity. So if I could go on to the next slide, because I know there'll be some company secretaries and governance folk listening to this seminar. Some of you will be saying, well, yeah, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the recommended practice we've got to get our boards to get their heads round? Well, for those of you who are using the code at the moment, the diversity principle actually is, in terms of recommended practice, when I looked at it again, it's incredibly narrow. It's only about encouraging inclusive and accessible participation, recruiting diverse trustees, and monitoring and reporting on diversity. This time round, and again, apologies, we've got to kind of do a bit more work to get the wording right, but we are going to frame the recommended practice around the following pillars. So, and it reflects the journey that boards would be going on. So first lot of recommended practice is under the heading of a board assessing its understanding, systems and culture. This is about a board working out what the baseline knowledge and understanding is. So the recommended practice will include things like a board assesses its current understanding of the EDI challenges and opportunities for the organisation, and it identifies gaps that could be filled by further learning, additional information and/or research. A second recommended practice that might fall under this first heading is a board assesses whether its meetings create an environment in which trustees can constructively challenge and whether all voices are enabled to be heard. And then a third recommended practice we think might sit well under this heading is a board assesses whether it role models inclusive behaviours. So once you've kind of assessed where you are on your journey, we think the second set of recommended practice is under the heading setting specific, so specific to particular charity, specific and realistic goals. And this is a series of recommended practice about establishing an organisational approach to EDI, about setting some goals and targets in line with the charity's purpose and its objectives. Some of those might be behavioural, some of those might be targets, for example, relating to board composition. And here, just to digress for a minute, unlike, say, Sport England's governance code, we're not going to include specific targets or quotas for board composition for, say, the percentage of female or black trustees, for example. So if I go on to the third heading, the third limb of the journey, having kind of set the goals and targets, we think the third grouping of recommended practice will be under the heading of reviewing performance in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, and sharing learning. And so recommended practice under this heading will be around the board monitoring the organisation's achievement towards the goals that have been set. It could be, sorry, apologies. It could be another recommended practice about taking action to create and maintain inclusive cultures, practices and behaviours in all its decision making, and the type of examples, and I think this is kind of one of the things we still need to kind of bottom out about what goes in the code and what goes in supporting guidance. But here, you know, in terms of the recommended practice about creating and maintaining inclusive cultures, practices and behaviors, it might be, for example, what is written in the trustee code of conduct and how it's used. It might be testing out whether all voices around the table are actually heard and valued in decision making. And then the final recommended practice I wanted to highlight under this particular heading was reviewing any obstacles to trusteeship, you know, to test out whether a diverse pool of candidates are genuinely attracted to trustee vacancies. And some of those obstacles might be practical and some of those might be behavioural or cultural. And then the fourth heading that we see in this new principle and recommended practice is about publishing, so being transparent and accountable, so publishing performance in relation to the goals that the board has set for the organisation in this area. So publishing its performance against the goals it set itself, and also being upfront about any learning to be gained around that. So that's a kind of quick canter. I just wanted to stress again that some of the areas that people have suggested as a recommended practice we think are really helpful, but perhaps too specific for the code and would make the code too wordy. And we're worried that they might date and distract away from the code's focus. So we are thinking some more about what we can do to enable and publicize supporting good guidance. So I think I've talked for quite a bit now. So before I kind of open up questions and perhaps ask a question for Parry, I think we wanted to run a poll to test out one of our ideas. As I said, unlike the sports code, we're not going to include any specific targets for diversity among trustees. And we'd be interested to know your views on whether you agree or disagree with that approach. And so we'd love it if you could vote now. There'll be no hanging chads for those of you of a certain age who can remember events way back when. There'll be no late ballots accepted. But if you did want to vote, we'd be really interested to get your views on this. I think we're going to give you a minute or two to vote, and maybe one of my colleagues will step in if I haven't teed it up properly. Oh. So unfortunately, my little box is in front of that green 61%. Is that people broadly supportive of our approach? Have I?
Yes, that's right, Rosie.
Excellent.
And then we've got 20% of respondents to this poll think that think that there should be something explicit. 61 agree with the kind of approach which you proposed, and then we've got 19% of people indicating that they're unsure.
Okay, so I might open up the questions and then I'll have a little look through the list and field some questions to you and to Parry. But Parry, can I just ask you first, do you agree with our approach of not setting targets in the code as you see in some other sectors?
So Rosie, I've thought about this lots, and I'm still open to having my mind changed. I think at this point, my view is that we need charities to set context-specific targets. So when I think back to my rural Lincolnshire bowling club example, and I think about them and their services perhaps are failing to reach working class communities, and so therefore for them their target might be to say have 2 or 3 positions open for working class representatives to help them become more reflective in the service they deliver. But then I think about the other example I gave, and that was the National Medical Research Charity. And I think they could go 2 ways. And one could be for them, as they do their assessment of where are we at right now, to look at the fact that they are there to tackle health inequalities. And as we know, those are most extreme, perhaps for disabled people of colour. And so having a board that reflects that strategic priority for them might be the target that they set. And I think the other way they could go, and this is where my worry about setting national targets sort of comes in, is that they could just go to say, well, actually, should we just reflect the national population and should we just use census stats as enforced perhaps by the code? Not that we do enforce through the code, but as set by the code. And for me, I think that would mean that the board itself wouldn't necessarily be aligning themselves with their strategic priority and actually missing an opportunity to tackle health inequality through their board makeup. So at the moment, I'm coming down on the side of saying that we need to say that the recommended practice is that charities set their own targets, diversity targets for their exec boards and for their boards, their non-execs. And I think it's based on 2 things. It's either based on the community that they seek to serve, if they are a service charity, or it could be based on what their charitable purpose is and what their strategic EDI priority is within that purpose, such as health inequality. And I think there's an opportunity for the code, rather than trying to set a central target, perhaps to call on infrastructure organisations to share examples of how charities have done this well. So maybe it's case studies of how charities have set targets, tools, and maybe even some data around inequalities to support boards to do that, to do this work and set their own targets within their own context. And I suppose on the other side of it, maybe there is some work for the code also to work with funders around how they set requirements for charities to demonstrate what their goals are or what their targets are, how they've defined them, and perhaps also what progress they're making towards them. So that's the side I'm coming down on right now.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful. If I'm just looking at the questions that have been posted, so I'm just going to kind of pull out 1 or 2. I think one for Dan maybe. It's how do you ensure diversity while working with a specific group of people? For example, a charity working with refugees and migrants. Have you got a view on that, Dan?
Oh, I think this comes back to just what Parry said, you know, in the answer to your last question, which is that I think it's about being very intentional about deciding kind of, you know, whether or not what is the best diversity for your board in terms of pursuing your charitable purpose and public benefit. We were really mindful, you know, in that whole debate around setting national quotas, to the idea that, you know, you might that you might force a situation which feels very out of kilter with what the charity exists to do, or the communities that it either currently serves or wishes to serve. And so I think it's about being intentional, about asking, you know, who are we here to serve, and what is our purpose, and who do we need around the boardroom in order to help us make better decisions in that respect. That's why I think I really agree with what Parry said at the very beginning, which is that this is a journey, and it's about constantly revisiting and analysing that. We often say that you can't fully achieve the code, and I think that's never more true than of this diversity principle. You should always be revisiting it and always asking, you know, does our board best reflect and mean that we've got the right kind of views and diversity of opinion to make the right decisions for those we want to serve. So I think it's really to reiterate what Parry said.
Okay.
Rosie, can I
yes.
comment on that? I suppose the other additional bit that I might add in is that for all charities who have a very specific group, and for this example, refugees and migrants, I wonder whether there's also, I'm trying not to use jargon, but intersectionality, the idea that within that group, there will be particular identities or particular parts of that community who might not have their voice that centred or might previously have not been involved in that decision making. So I think that process, and as Dan said, that sort of intentionality of saying, well, what is our purpose and who is it that we're trying to serve through our charitable purpose, can apply even within those community groups to say, well, who within this group are we not hearing from, who are we not providing our services to? And I realise I've used intersectionality, which is a little bit of jargon.
That's okay. That's fine, and I think we might maybe we are into expanding our glossary in a way that kind of would be helpful. And Parry, another one for you. Somebody's asking, can you share the examples of the take action, review and learn steps that you mentioned? And I wondered, there's nothing like, you got a consultant in a public arena of saying, oh, I wonder if perhaps there could be a blog or an article that turns what you said into something that could be made more widely available, she said, so, optimistically.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, as you said, Rosie, that there's lots that we gathered in terms of research that won't go into the code. So we gathered lots of case studies, examples of people taking some action and learning from it and then applying it, which I think we do need to put into some blogs, and we do need to share some of those case studies that will help to bring some of these examples or ways of working to life. And I suppose, to speak on a very broad level, there are a number of organisations who have talked about how do we set new inclusive behaviours, and so they've set themselves things like, what's our code of conduct, which I know is also talked about in other parts of the code. How do we set a code of conduct? How do we hold ourselves to it? And what they've seen from setting one is that the things that they thought were really important, some of them were, some of them weren't quite the key ones. And as they began to test it, they realized actually these are the things that shut down conversation or stop those difficult discussions that I think help good decision making happen. And so actually they've then gone away, learned a little bit more about how can we inclusively make decisions, and therefore reshaped their code of conduct as a result of that. So that's sort of a broad example, but we've got tons more from the research, which I think I really agree with you, Rosie, we need to share somehow.
Okay, and another question, maybe both of you might want to answer this one. Someone's saying, what do you think the pros and cons are of having a service user group reporting into a board as an interim measure to build capacity? I don't know if either of you want to start. Pros and cons of having a service user group reporting into the board.
I suppose I'm happy to chip in. I think that's an interesting and sometimes very useful mechanism. I mean, particularly when you think about some organisations where it is not always appropriate to ask service users to commit sufficient time to be board members, and I have done work in, for example, the hospice sector, where the board and indeed the service users, when asked, felt that wasn't something that they wanted to do. I still think that you can make generalizations in that, and that can be a little bit kind of that might not be entirely helpful, but there is definitely a place for it, place for these kinds of groups, and I think that if it's used to drive decision making in the boardroom and broaden the perspective of trustees, allow you access to more data and more information on the needs of your beneficiaries, then that's only, in my view, a good thing. But I do think that it's slightly different from what we're talking about in terms of board diversity, and not necessarily an either or. I think you should still go through the journey that kind of Parry set out, in terms of assessing where you want to be, thinking about barriers, thinking about recruitment, monitoring, reviewing. All of that remains important, even if you have a service user group helping to inform your thinking. So yeah, it's great, and I think it can be a real useful training ground and route to the board for people, but I don't think it's an alternative to thinking seriously about your diversity as a board.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with that. I think from my, the only bit I'd add is that I think the service user group model is a really good form of consultation and engagement with those who make use of the services, and that is part of the role of the board, I think, to reflect the service user group. I think diversity on the board has so many other functions that you couldn't necessarily fulfill through a service user group. So I think, again, it's thinking through what's the purpose of governance and what is the value of having equality, diversity and inclusion at that governance level, not just through the consultation and engagement route.
Okay, and another, this is quite a specific one, but so our charity is Afro-Caribbean, focusing on education for the local Black community. Should diversity and inclusion reach the other way, i.e. to include white trustees, as today all board members are Black? Is this representative of being diverse given the local community? Either of you have any thoughts on that? I suppose without knowing me.
I'm happy
Yeah,
to give that a go.
Yeah.
So I think if you are an organisation that's clear on your purpose, having a board, again, going back to what we talked about, being really contextualised and saying our board needs to be reflective and able to deliver our purpose, then I think that's great. I'm a board member of UK Black Pride. We are all people of colour because our target communities are all people of colour as well. Where in the past we've thought about, do we need diversity, we tend to think about what's the intersectionality within that group of people. So we're all people of colour. Some of us are lesbian, some of us are trans, some of us are bi, and we're thinking about those intersections. We're different ages, we're different parts of the POC community, the people of colour community. We also, we try to think about if there are, so I don't know whether the question here is saying, do we need a white trustee on the board? I think sometimes we on the board have talked about, do we need to have routes into other areas or other power bases? And I think that's not about having the people on the board, but about having networks outside of the board to influence change in other ways. So I would go back to, I think if your purpose is clear, which it sounds like it really is, then being reflective of that purpose and the community you seek to serve is absolutely the right focus.
Okay, I might do another one, and I might kick off the next one with you, Dan, if that's all right. So someone else has typed in saying, I understand and applaud your efforts on EDI. Thank you very much, whoever typed that. I chair a place-based foundation in a small town with a very small number of BAME residents whom we have targeted and sought to onboard for many years. We serve anyone and everyone in the town in a wide variety of ways. Need brings our priority. How would you advise us what we should do that we aren't already doing? Do you want to kick off, Dan, on that one?
Yeah, perhaps with the approach rather than the specifics of the case. I'd be very well placed to speak about that, but I think that there's, I mean, it's firstly, it sounds like you're making good effort to reach out to parts of your own community, and the communities that you would like to serve, recognise are perhaps under reflected on your board or not reflected on your board. So, that is good, and it sounds like you've made good effort in those areas. I think that there probably, there probably is something here which goes back to that first point that we made around deciding first, what communities you want to, you feel you need to target, or where you have diversity gaps on your board. I would perhaps then consider, speaking with people, asking people kind of why they haven't applied in the past, or whether they're aware of your organisation, or perhaps speaking to other organisations that operate in particular parts of the community which you're keen to reflect on the board. and perhaps altering and adapting your practice accordingly to that. I do think it comes back to that journey of iterate, review, change your practice, change how you do things, and then keep constantly kind of revisiting that to check that you're still reflecting. You're attracting the right types of people, but you're also reflecting your cause and purpose. I don't think I've got anything more specific I can say than that, really, unless Parry would like to come in on some more practical stuff.
I suppose it takes me also back to my rural Lincolnshire example, which I'm really flogging this one, aren't I? I think there is something to be mindful about that, and this has come up in the research, that quite often diversity is being conflated with more black and brown faces around a table. And I think what's really helpful about the rural Lincolnshire example is that actually, for some communities, as you've said for this example, actually that's a very small part of the community, and perhaps not a part of the community that's interested or needs the services that you're delivering. So I think it is again about going back and saying, well, who are the parts of the community that we're not perhaps reaching, and being targeted and focused on engaging those voices and being reflective of those people within the community. And so for rural Lincolnshire, it probably is working class within that bowling club community. And it's fine that they don't have people of colour around the boardroom. I think that's absolutely fine if that's not a need of the charity. So I think I would say, again, going back to who is within for your particular group, who is within that community that is currently accessing services and who perhaps is not. And how can you find out why they are perhaps not, and how you can engage them in some of your governance.
Okay, I've got one question, not particularly about diversity, but more generally, but I'll read it out anyway. So governance reviews, the code says every 3 years for large charities. In practice, how many charities do this, do you think? Have you considered changing the recommended frequency? Well, my take is I think the number of charities doing it for larger ones is increasing, and it's becoming the norm. Not sure whether some things might get stalled a bit in a post-COVID environment. We are not going to change the frequency on that. That bit of the charity governance code will not change. In fact, it's fair to say that only the integrity and the equality, diversity and inclusion principles within the code are going to change, unless we've spotted a typo that we didn't correct previously, but it will just be those two.
It's also worth, just on that point, Rosie, I think it's worth noting that the code does encourage an annual review of governance for larger organisations, and I think back to it's the same principle with diversity. I think this does need to be a process rather than an event. And so an annual review of your governance internally, and every 3 years an external review for larger organisations, I think still feels right and proportionate.
And I'm mindful that we're moving on. I've got a couple of slides to go, so I just wanted to ask both of you: are there any kind of questions that you're surprised people haven't asked, or any points that either of you would like to highlight before I summarize or close? Sorry, I've put you both on the
I suppose one very brief point is just about the fear of getting it wrong, which I had expected perhaps somebody to ask, and I think that's why I really am trying to emphasize the idea, and I think we all have, that this is a journey, and starting where you are, starting from what you need and what your priorities are, setting contextualized, really realistic goals, and having a go and being willing to learn from your mistakes is really important. And I would just say that don't let the fear of getting it wrong stop you. And I think there is a bit of a call to arms to the infrastructure parts of our sector to do as much as possible to help people not to get it wrong, but when they do get it wrong, to again be able to support that process to happen. And whether that's case studies, data, training, etc., I think that's for us to think through now, whether we can make those calls to arms. But yeah, don't let the fear stop you getting started on the journey.
That's great. That's great. And from you, Dan, anything else you wanted to
Oh,
highlight?
no, I don't think I can say it better than that. I think probably I would pick up on that sense of this being a journey as well. The idea that, you know, people will look at this and see the principles and the new recommended practice and think, oh my gosh, here's another set of things that we're expected to think about. And you know, whenever I work with boards, I always say it's about identifying, you know, the changes you want to make over that next 12 months and really focusing in on them. Don't try and do all of this at once, because that will be overwhelming. I think it's about good practice for a reason, and it's about iterating. So it's a further point to Parry's about also remember this whole document is a journey for you, and you cannot be expected to score 10 out of 10 on everything. In fact, whenever I work with a board who does score 10 out of 10 out of everything, normally there's somebody's not really seeing the whole picture there. So yeah, it's a journey.
Okay, that sounds like a good point to maybe move on to our final couple of slides. So I just wanted to have something on a kind of what we've not done, and I've kind of highlighted it before. I think one of the strengths of a code, of any code, is that they tend to be ideally quite pithy documents, and they're very clear about what an organization needs to do to meet the code. So that's one of its strengths. Its limitation of a code is it won't necessarily give you all the answers of how to do it. And I think that's probably been one of the frustrations that people have had with the previous version or the current version of the code in relation to diversity. I've had lots of people say to me, we want to do something, we don't know how. So I definitely think this time round there is a need for supporting guidance, and we're still thinking through what's appropriate to attach to a code and what would be appropriate to ask other organizations to do. And generally it's a kind of call to action for others, such as the likes of NCVO, WCVA, and all the other members of the steering group to provide supporting guidance to help charities on this journey. So finally, next steps. So we are working on finalising the wording for the equality, diversity and inclusion principle, because we do want to get it right. And so we may test that out with one or two critical friends. So those of you who've been allies and helpful in the past, we might be reaching out to you. And I think I'll lose the will to live if we don't publish it by the end of the year, though, because I think things get a bit stale. So I'm absolutely, I will make sure that we publish the updated code by the end of the year at the very latest, and hopefully in good time before then. And then we will keep the code under review on a regular basis as to when the next kind of formal review might take place. Kind of hard to say at this stage. Originally we were thinking every 3 years, but it might be 2024 rather than 2023 next time round. I think that will be for folk to determine a bit closer to the end. So thank you very much for all listening in, and to the 2010 of you who stayed to the end. I do respect you, so thank you very much. And finally, we've included some links if you want to see a bit more about the consultation on the code. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the day. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.